Felt really, really good. The fast was easy. I took my pictures. I looked awesome as well. And then I went in for blood work. And then as soon as they took my blood, I knew I was in trouble. Vigorous Steve here with my worst urinalysis results. Now, I understand that a urinalysis typically isn't part of general blood work screening because we're analyzing a different fluid of the body. With a urinalysis, we analyze the urine, and with blood work, we analyze the blood. And not all labs are able to do the additional testing besides the blood work analysis, which is a shame because a urinalysis will give you additional insight into kidney function. Because when you're a bodybuilder or physically very active, many of the markers which are related to kidney function might be a little bit skewed because of the dietary practices or the training intensity that's required to be a bodybuilder or the pharmacology that's involved. Sometimes those kidney markers might be a little bit skewed, and it's good to do an additional urinalysis to give you additional measuring points, right? To see how well your kidneys are actually functioning. And of course, it would be better to do a 24-hour urine collection test with an inulin clearance assessment, but that's a little bit further down the line when you see, some kidney markers really off, and then you'll have to assess the true glomerular filtration rate with a 24-hour urine collection test. So in this video, I want to assess mostly my urinalysis, which is a little bit over a year ago, from February 2020, when I ran an experiment while I was fasting. So it doesn't really have to do anything with performance-enhancing drugs, but it mostly has to do with an experiment that I was running, which changed my blood work results and my urinalysis to the point that I want to quit and retire bodybuilding. But luckily for me, I was able to resolve my issues within 2 weeks and get comparable blood work and comparable urinalysis to what I had a couple months prior when I did my last full checkup. So we'll compare all of that in this video. So let me give you guys a little bit of a backstory and overlay the pictures of what I looked like when I did this blood work. Again, I'm probably the only one who gives you the pictures and the blood work at the same time. And even though those pictures look pretty good, I was very happy with how I looked. And I was also very happy with how I felt after a 5.5 day fast, because it certainly was the easiest fast I've done up until that point. And I, now I have access to liraglutide, obviously. So now it should be a lot easier. But back then, that was probably the easiest fast I've ever done. So this is how I looked. My performance-enhancing drug protocol was as follows: 250 milligrams testosterone enanthate plus 25 milligrams of aromasin plus 2 units of growth hormone plus a low dose of long-acting insulin. Lantus, I'm not going to give you the dose because using long-acting insulin while you're fasting is a little bit risky, and you need to have fundamental understanding of your blood glucose before you undergo such a protocol. And yes, I have those protocols available during consultations only. You won't find it in the comprehensive guide to responsible insulin use because there's a lot of nuances that come along with using insulin for body recomposition. So that was my performance-enhancing drug protocol at that time. For the guys that say that you need Trenbolone, Primobolan, etc., to look good, I think I look pretty good on testosterone and aromasin, growth hormone, and insulin only. I think I was also using clenbuterol for those 5.5 days that I was fasting, so, a fat burner was involved. But considering I was only using testosterone as the sole true anabolic, I think I looked pretty good. So don't be misconstrued by those guys that say that you need a boatload and an insane combination of different PEDs to look good. You can look good on testosterone as a sole anabolic. There's your proof. Now, at the time while I was fasting, I wanted to include sodium bicarbonate because I read several studies that sodium bicarbonate or baking soda was able to mitigate or prevent muscle atrophy while fasting in a severe caloric deficit. Again, not many bodybuilders fast because they're always so afraid of muscle loss. I think I'm one of the few who can actually stomach a 5.5 day fast. Of course, there's several coaches out there that would recommend a 1 day fast, maybe 24 hours, 36 hours. You go from Sunday evening to Monday evening, for example. And some guys would go until Tuesday morning. So that would be a 36-hour fast. And I think I'm one of the few coaches who actually does 5.5 day fasts. And I do that with some of my clients as well, because I'm not really afraid of muscle loss. Obviously, you lose glycogen stores and water retention and intestinal mass, so your body weight goes down significantly. I think I weighed around 106, 107 kgs before I started this fast, and then I ended up at 101.5 kgs. Unfortunately, I don't have any before and after pictures, only the after pictures, because I've done these fasts so many times. I would do it 5.5 days every 3 months. And I got the blood work before, after. I've done it so many times. So this time I didn't do it. So I only have the after pictures and the after blood work. And the reason why I want to do the sodium bicarbonate experiment, partially because of the research that I found showing that it was able to preserve more muscle tissue when sodium bicarbonate was included. And again, since I'm not really afraid of muscle loss or worried about muscle loss, I still wanted to see if I could optimize the fasting process for bodybuilders a little bit further. Now, judging by the blood work, the pictures obviously look good. And again, it was the easiest fast that I've ever done up until that point. Nowadays we have the liraglutide and the dulaglutides to choose from. But back then I didn't know about GLP-1 receptor agonists to reduce the appetite. So up until February of 2020, this was the easiest fast that I've ever done. And I was able to actually look fuller somehow. Now, when I did my research, the dosages of including baking soda while fasting were kind of all over the place. So I decided to go with the highest tolerable dose of baking soda for athletes, which was 300 milligrams per 1 kilogram of body weight. So being over 100 kilos, that resulted in 30 grams of baking soda per day. Now, the reason why we use baking soda to increase athletic performance is by changing the acid buffer in the bloodstream, allowing for more oxygen delivery. Because now carbon dioxide increases in the bloodstream, and there's a balance between carbon dioxide and oxygen. So by increasing carbon dioxide in the bloodstream, by taking baking soda, you're able to increase oxygen delivery. And by lowering the acid buffer of the bloodstream, we're also able to remove some of the metabolic waste products, like lactic acid, for example, which occur when you do strenuous workouts or endurance sports. So it gives you a performance boost in that aspect as well. Increased oxygen delivery and removal of metabolic waste products afterwards. So it's highly beneficial for endurance sports. There's some evidence that it's beneficial to prevent muscle atrophy while you're doing fasting. So I combined both aspects and went with 30 grams of baking soda or 6 servings of 5 grams baking soda, which is a heaping teaspoon, 6 times per day. Felt really, really good. The fast was easy. I took my pictures. I looked awesome as well. And then I went in for blood work. And then as soon as I took my blood, I knew I was in trouble. Because what you see here is that the blood is very, very black. And whether that comes from increased deoxygenated red blood cells or hemoglobin, again, more redder blood is oxygenated, and darker blood, and in this case almost black blood, it's severely deoxygenated. So again, you're changing the acid buffer in the bloodstream, allowing for more oxygen to reach metabolically active tissue. And by, removing the lactic acid buffer, you'll probably get more deoxygenated blood. And as we'll see from the blood work, besides the metabolic waste products, the lactic acid, a lot of stuff starts dumping into the bloodstream because it's the acid buffer that actually, keeps some of the metabolic waste products in the metabolically active tissue and slowly allows that to be trickled and metabolized and detoxified by being transported in the bloodstream. And again, all things considering, I can't say that this experiment was a success. That's why I never mentioned sodium bicarbonate whenever I would talk about fasting, even though I ended up looking pretty good and the 5.5 day fast was reasonably easy. After I looked at the color of my blood and I got my urinalysis results and my blood work results, I was not so happy with the experiment. And again, that's why I never mention it. I did this experiment so you don't have to. So the urinalysis that I got the same day, a little bit later, you see that my specific gravity is low. So let me clarify a little bit about what specific gravity is. Specific gravity analyzes how much particles are in the urine. Now, water would have a specific gravity of 1. So you'll never get a specific gravity of 1. That's basically demi-water, right? Distilled water without any minerals or any other particles. And the urine obviously contains particles because that's how detoxification works. You want some of the particles to exit your body through the urine. And it's a measurement of hydration. So more particles within the urine raises the specific gravity, indicating proper hydration or dehydration. And the lower your specific gravity is, ideally you want it below the middle of the reference range. I heard some people say it should be below 1.010 or 1.015. Usually I keep it around 1.005 because I go in hydrated. So that's the specific gravity, water, plus the amount of particles contained within. And whether that's blood, protein, creatine, albumin, etc. It's the amount of particles which are found within the urine in comparison to, water without any particles. So that's how we measure hydration. Now, when you look at the pH level of this urinalysis, you see that it's leaning towards the basic side of the reference range. A pH of 7 is considered to be neutral. The reference range for urinalysis is 5 to 8.5. And my reading was 8.3, which is actually very close to the pH of sodium bicarbonate itself. I believe that its pH is 8.4. So it was very close, even though I didn't take any baking soda on the day of the urinalysis when I was going in for blood work. I took 30 grams of baking soda the day before, and I'm sure some of that pH reduction was still lingering. Again, I went in hydrated, but the pH was still reasonably high because of the lingering baking soda. So that's the only time I've ever seen a pH that high on my blood work results. In many cases, it's a little bit on the low side, so leaning towards the acidity. So that's a pH of 5.5, 6, maybe 6.5. Sometimes it's 7, and it highly depends on how hydrated you are and how much protein you're eating in your diet, because it's usually the protein that increases the acidity level of the urinalysis. So that was a little bit on the high side, but I can explain that away with the sodium bicarbonate experiment that I was running. And of course, when I saw the color of my blood, I was already a little bit worried. And then I saw trace amounts of protein in my urinalysis. And then I wanted to quit bodybuilding altogether. Now, I've seen trace amounts of protein in my urinalysis previously in September 2014. So that's a little bit after I run that 1,000 milligrams of boldenone experiment. In September 2014, I was running 225 milligrams of trenbolone, and I think a comparable amount of mastrone. And what was it? 750 milligrams a test. Felt pretty good at that time. I'll see if I can find any pictures. It's probably going to be from a little bit earlier because I didn't take so many pictures at that time because I was always so busy, helping athletes compete at the Asian Championships or World Championships. So I'll see if I can overlay some pictures and then show you the blood work results of that time when I was running trenbolone, probably the last trenbolone cycle that I ever did. And then I also saw trace amounts of protein in my urinalysis. And, back then I didn't know so much about kidney function. So I went through the entire ringer. I did an ultrasound of my kidneys. I did a 24-hour urine collection test with an inulin clearance test. I checked my cystatin C, and everything came back perfect. And there was no trace amounts of protein in my urinalysis on the second test, which I did a couple days later. So you see here that my specific gravity is a little bit on the high side. Again, not properly hydrated because back then I would just, you fast completely and then you go in for blood work and urinalysis. pH is on the middle side. So even though I was on trenbolone, my urinalysis was not acidic, but there's trace amounts of protein in my urine. And my creatinine was also pretty high at the time. So again, judging by this high creatinine reading and having trace amounts of protein in my urinalysis, I went through the ringer and, my glomerular filtration rate came back at 100% because it was based on the inulin clearance test, and 100% of the inulin was cleared over a period of 24 hours. And the ultrasound didn't show any sclerosis or inflammation of the kidneys, and the cystatin C was in range as well. So, I've seen these readings before, so I wasn't really too worried that something significant was going on. But considering it was the second time I saw trace amounts of protein in my urine, I thought it was time to quit. So, when you do your research, you talk to the nephrologist, they don't consider trace amounts of protein in your urine to be pathological and an indication of an underlying condition. Still, it's a marker that is off. And ideally, as a bodybuilder, you want as many markers in range as possible, right? That's the ultimate goal. You want everything in range while still looking good, which is probably impossible unless you have awesome genetics and you don't have to, abuse the drugs that much. Now, while we're on the subject of these old blood work results, you'll see that my total cholesterol, HDL, and LDL concentrations are actually quite low. You would almost say respectable for the amount of performance-enhancing drugs that I was running at that time, especially considering that Trenbolone is quite potent in its ability to skew lipid concentrations, and these lipids actually look quite good. That's because I was running 10 milligrams of Lipitor per week, which is a very low dose. 2.5 milligrams Lipitor 4 times per week is what I was doing at that time. Lipitor is a statin which inhibits cholesterol synthesis, and in this case it was able to keep my lipids somewhat favorable, even though I would like to see my HDL higher. But again, running Trenbolone, HDL is not going to be that favorable on any dose of Trenbolone with any inclusion of a statin or citrus bergamot or red yeast rice. The reason why I discontinued the Lipitor is because it made me quite sore. Some of the statins can contribute to muscle soreness, and I felt that it was inhibiting my workouts. I'm not really sure if it contributed to the elevated creatinine or trace amounts of protein in my urine. I highly doubt it. But again, I took it out and I didn't see comparable readings on creatinine or trace amounts of protein until February 2020. But it's a very long time that I had, favorable creatinine and normal urinalysis results. So let's fast forward to the blood work results of December 2019, about 2 months before I did the blood work after this 5.5 day fast with 30 grams of baking soda, just to give a little bit of a baseline to see where my blood work was at before running the experiment. So you see that my blood urea nitrogen is at the top of the reference range. Again, high protein intake. Creatinine is elevated, 1.47 milligrams per deciliter, which is pretty representative of where I'm at when I'm, training insane, and I carry a little bit more muscle mass than I do at this point in time. So I was able to reduce my creatinine, after 10 years of having it elevated. I was able to reduce my creatinine to below 1 milligram per deciliter. But again, that's after this fasting mimicking diet. So 1.47, 1.5 milligrams per deciliter, that's pretty representative of where it was for the last couple of years. A little bit higher than normal, but considering that my cystatin C levels are always in range, never been out of range, never guys, never out of range. And my 24-hour urine collection tests and inulin clearance tests always came back successful, where 100% of the inulin was cleared within 24 hours, indicating normal kidney function. Was wrote off the elevated creatinine as an increased amount of muscle mass and increased training intensity. You see that my creatine phosphokinase is about 2,300 units per liter, which is pretty representative of where it is usually when I'm training insane. Creatine phosphokinase is an enzyme which converts creatine and adenosine triphosphate into phosphocreatine, which acts as an energy buffer for adenosine triphosphate again. So it's basically an energy reserve, and when that's metabolized, it creates creatinine. So by having elevated creatine phosphate kinase in the bloodstream, it means that you're creating muscular damage. And then this creatine phosphate kinase is able to enter the bloodstream, or basically leak from skeletal muscle into the bloodstream, raising serum concentrations. So CPK is usually used as an indication to assess if a heart attack occurred. Of course, creatine phosphokinase is also present in the heart, where it contributes to phosphocreatine and ATP synthesis. And in case of a heart attack or rhabdomyolysis, you see that creatine phosphate kinase in the bloodstream is maybe 10,000 units per liter, or 20,000, or even 50,000 units per liter. I've seen that as well. We'll save that for a different video, not on my blood work, but on some people that asked me for blood work advice that had legitimate rhabdomyolysis. So in this case, 2,300 units per liter, pretty representative of where it usually is when I'm training that intensely. At that time, I was not running any clenbuterol, and clenbuterol is able to raise CPK concentrations in the bloodstream, whether that's from additional heart palpitations or the increased mind-muscle connection and central nervous system stimulation that you get from clenbuterol. I'm a little bit unsure about, but I do know that adding clenbuterol to your stack will raise CPK concentrations to a certain extent. And we'll discuss the rest of these blood work results from December 2019 briefly. You see that my lipids are actually quite good, considering I was running, I think I was already at 1250 milligrams of testosterone 2 months before the fasting experiment, when I was running 1750 milligrams of testosterone per week. So at the time I was running 1250 milligrams testosterone per week, 5 injections of 250 milligrams each. Again, during the off season, I ended up at 750 milligrams testosterone per week in a steep caloric surplus. And then as I would start my cutting phase, which I was in at this point in time, the blood work from December 2019 and the blood work from February 2020, which we'll get into after this one, I was in a caloric deficit. And as my calories come down, I would at one point lose strength. I wasn't able to maintain strength. And then my testosterone dose would come up with an increment of 1 ampule per week. So 1250 milligrams testosterone per week at that time. Then I increased to 1500 and then 1750 about 2 months later. And then my HDL was still 43. Quite good. 43 milligrams per deciliter. Not too bad considering I was on 1250 milligrams testosterone per week. All right, liver function test, a little bit on the high side. Again, it wouldn't surprise me if I already had non-alcoholic fatty liver disease at that time. So this is after the carnivore experiment, which raised my liver enzymes with 10 or 20 points. We'll probably discuss that in my worst liver enzyme results. So at the time, my liver enzymes hovered around 80 to 110 units per liter. Again, I was still running Accutane, perhaps non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and training intensity increases liver enzyme concentrations as well. Just like creatine phosphokinase, enzymes leak into the bloodstream with skeletal muscle damage, which is the whole goal of hypertrophy training, right? So do the aminotransferases, which are not only found in the liver, also found in skeletal muscle. So, a little bit elevated. I wish, I knew about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease back then. I probably could have had them around 50, 60 units per liter. Still over the reference range, but a little bit more favorable than these readings. And my estradiol was 48.7 picograms per milliliter. A little bit over the reference range. I usually wasn't too worried about it. And again, I was a little bit watery, but hey, estradiol also contributes to anabolism and well-being and favorable lipids, as you can see for my HDL, which were still quite good considering the amount of testosterone I was running. And at that time, I also checked my cystatin C concentrations because I've been doing that every 6 months ever since I got the trace amounts of protein in my urine back in September 2014. And you see here that my cystatin C is nice at basically at the bottom of the reference range, 0.77 milligrams per liter on a reference range of 0.62 to 1.11. And with those baseline readings out of the way, let's move over to the blood work results that I got after the sodium bicarbonate while fasting experiment. And you see that these are not so good, especially the kidney function markers. Now, my blood glucose was a little bit on the low side. Again, I was running a low dose of Lantus, which we're not going to get into, but you see that it's slightly below the reference range, 68 milligrams per deciliter. My blood urea nitrogen crashed to below the bottom of the reference range because I was not eating any protein for 5.5 days. But it's all pretty normal. I believe I have a before, during, and after fasting video as well. I'll link that up above so you guys can watch that video with much better blood work results than we'll discuss in this video. Creatinine went up from, let's say, 1.5 milligrams per deciliter all the way up to 1.93 milligrams per deciliter. Now, on all my previous fasts, creatinine would come down with 0.1, 0.2 milligrams per deciliter over the course of a week by stopping training and just giving my body a break. And creatine phosphate kinase would drop with about 50%. And this is the only fast in my life where creatinine and creatine phosphate kinase actually went up. So it went from a baseline reading of 1.5 milligrams per deciliter, the creatinine, from 1.5 milligrams per deciliter to 1.93 milligrams per deciliter. And creatine phosphate kinase went up from, let's say, a baseline reading of 2,300, 2,500 units per liter to 3,700 units per liter. So it's almost the polar opposite, or even higher than the polar opposite of what normally would happen while I was fasting and taking a week break from the gym. Now, to be fair, I was running clenbuterol. At this time, again, it's a 5.5 day fast, but in previous fasts, when I would run clenbuterol, even then, my creatine phosphate kinase would come down. So this is the only time where it came up. And it's probably from the sodium bicarbonate, reducing the acid buffer in the bloodstream, allowing more creatinine and creatine phosphate kinase to exit skeletal muscle and basically get dumped into the bloodstream and stressing my kidneys perhaps, the creatinine, resulting in trace amounts of protein in my urine and the urinalysis that we discussed previously. So I was very concerned, to be honest, when I saw these readings. I'm like, WTF, what's going on within my body? I felt really, really good after that fast. And the picture showed that it looked good as well. So even though I looked good and felt good, what I've always been trying to tell you guys, even though you look good and feel good, it doesn't mean that your blood work is going to be good. And this is another proof of that. Even though I looked good, I felt good, and the fast was the easiest I've ever done. And I was surprisingly hard and dense, considering I didn't eat any food. So the density and the hardness and making it easy clearly came from the sodium bicarbonate. It also kind of ruined my blood work and my urinalysis in the process. So, again, was it worth it? Probably not. But again, you learn through experimentation, and it's not like the clinical literature is there, because the clinical literature tells me that sodium bicarbonate, albeit lower dosages, is able to preserve muscle tissue. And, in the studies, they didn't mention any deleterious health effect on your creatinine or creatine phosphate kinase or protein in the urinalysis. So, again, we get a little bit wiser through experimentation and understand that the clinical literature doesn't always apply. So, my kidney function got worse, but my lipids stayed pretty comparable. You see that cholesterol, HDL, and LDL are pretty similar to where they were before. HDL actually came up a little bit, from 43 to 47 milligrams per deciliter. And LDL came down also slightly, even though my testosterone went up from 1,250 milligrams to 1,750 milligrams per week. That's why I always say test is best, all things considering, because I'm able to keep my lipids pretty favorable, considering the dose is quite high. Again, in a caloric deficit. So whatever health supplementation I was running at the time, citrus bergamot, fish oil at each meal, doing daily cardio, was not running any GW1516, not running any SR9009. I was running clenbuterol, and my lipids weren't affected from the increase in testosterone or the obscene amount of sodium bicarbonate that I was running. But even though the lipids stayed pretty comparable, my liver enzymes certainly got worse. After this sodium bicarbonate and fasting experiment, and normally my liver enzymes would drop by half also, just like my creatine phosphate kinase, I would take a week break, get plenty of psyllium husk, right, to detoxify some of these liver enzymes into the bile acid, and then they would be bound up by the psyllium husk fiber and excreted the next day. So normally my liver enzymes would drop by about 50% and come right back down to the top of the reference range, let's say around 40 to 50 units per liter. And this time they also went up to 173 units per liter for AST, and the ALT came to 90 units per liter. not the result I was expecting. And again, I suspect it's from changing the acid buffer in the bloodstream with the obscene amount of baking soda that I was taking for 5 days prior to doing this blood work. After this experiment, I also checked my serum electrolytes to see how much of an effect a reasonably high dose of baking soda would have on my sodium, potassium, chloride, and total carbon dioxide concentrations in the bloodstream. And even though 30 grams of baking soda contains a reasonably high amount of sodium, serum sodium concentrations were towards the bottom of the reference range, 137 milliequivalent per liter, which is representative of where it usually is every time I do my serum electrolyte. So it didn't really change my serum concentrations of sodium. But my total carbon dioxide concentrations came up. Usually it's around 28, 29 milliequivalent per liter, and it increased to 32 milliequivalent per liter. And that's because sodium bicarbonate converts into carbon dioxide in the stomach acid, and some of that converts into carbon dioxide in the bloodstream as well. When sodium bicarbonate reacts with the stomach acid, it creates carbon dioxide. That's why, most cases after a serving of 5 grams, 7 grams on a teaspoon, you would burp, similar to how you would burp from soda, which contains carbon dioxide as well, and is able to alter your stomach acidity also, not to the extent that baking soda can, but it can alter it a little bit. So that's why I usually recommend people not to take any soda around the meal, because you want that stomach acidity to be sufficient to digest the meal, right? But I was taking baking soda on an empty stomach, and I was fasting for 5.5 days, so no stomach acid was required, even though I was burping, a decent amount after every serving. Some of that carbon dioxide ends up in the bloodstream, raising the concentrations to slightly over the reference range. Now, I wasn't really worried about that, again, because it also increases oxygen within the bloodstream, because your body tries to, remain in a decent balance. But I believe they don't offer the oxygen concentration, direct oxygen concentration in the bloodstream, besides checking your red blood cells, hemoglobin, etc., right? Which is where most of the oxygen is contained within. Now, calcium and magnesium, pretty representative of where they usually are. So the only thing of note on my serum electrolytes is that my total carbon dioxide went up, which came down 2 weeks after doing blood work again. Estradiol was pretty comparable to the baseline reading 2 months earlier, 51.8 picograms per milliliter. All good, nice in that libido favorable range. So, let's go over the kidney function test, which I did 2 weeks later after getting these results, which wanted me to quit bodybuilding. So I reintroduced the food, went back to the gym, stayed on the same dose of testosterone, took the clenbuterol out, and obviously threw the remainder of the sodium bicarbonate in the trash because I was not very happy with the results that I got. And then after 2 weeks, my creatinine fell back down to baseline 1.46 milligrams per deciliter. Creatine phosphokinase reduced by half again, even though I was training. But again, I removed the clenbuterol, and I think I wasn't training that intensely, just going through the motions again, because I had this lingering thought in the back of my head that I was going to retire from bodybuilding. So, I didn't take it too seriously. It came down from about 3,700 to 2,200 units per liter. So I consider that to be a success. Lipids stayed pretty much the same, even improved a little bit. HDL came up from 47 to 48 milligrams per deciliter. And it's probably the only good readings that I got over this period, or the readings that improved over this period. And the liver enzymes came down a little bit, albeit not as much as I'd like it to be. Again, I expected a little bit more reduction. Again, there was probably a little bit of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease present, and clearance of the liver enzymes isn't going that fast when there's fat present in the liver. That's why in most cases of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, liver enzymes are increased in the bloodstream. So AST came down to 147 units per liter, and the ALT came down to 91 units per liter. Probably because I wasn't topping the aminotransferases off with an insane training intensity. Now, again, in true fashion of kidney health, I also checked my cystatin C levels again, even though it's basically been 2 months that I already checked it. But comparing to the baseline readings of 0.77 milligrams per liter, now my cystatin went up to 0.9 milligrams per liter. Again, within the reference range, but it is of note that cystatin C went up. Now, since then, my cystatin C has reduced even further, and I highly attribute astragalus root extract to that. Even though astragalus root extract didn't really alter or improve my serum creatinine concentrations, I did see that after the longer I've been taking astragalus root extract, my cystatin C concentrations have been coming down and down and down further and further and further. So after a fasting mimicking diet, my cystatin C was 0.71 milligrams per liter, which is even lower than the baseline readings that I had in December 2019 before I did this fasting experiment. And, 2 weeks after the fasting experiment where it was 0.90 milligrams per liter. So it's been improving for that entire time, even though, my creatinine improved since then also, obviously, because I stopped training and did the fasting mimicking diet for a while. I'm not exactly sure where my creatinine is at this current moment in time after going back to the gym and gaining a little bit of more muscle mass in return. So I'll check that at the end of this month, and then we can see how much of an effect the training has on my serum creatinine concentrations. And yes, of course, I will do my cystatin C at the same time to see if that increased as well. And when you look at the urinalysis, which I of course also did when I went in for follow-up blood work, you see that everything has returned to normal and comparable to the baseline readings of December 2019. So after reviewing the urinalysis and the blood work 2 weeks after the fasting with baking soda experiment, I felt relieved because, again, most of the markers returned to baseline of December 2019. And I decided to continue with my cutting phase and not change anything to my performance-enhancing drug protocol because it was very comparable to, again, the markers that I had from December 2019. So I honestly think that most of these skewed blood work results came from the removing the acid buffer in the bloodstream, allowing for some of the metabolic waste products or enzymes to dump into the bloodstream at an accelerated rate. Normally, the acid buffer in the bloodstream prevents that by keeping lactic acid and perhaps other compounds within metabolically active tissue, and allow the filtering organs, like the kidneys or the liver or the lymphatic system, to, take their sweet time to detox these metabolic waste products. So even though it might sound very exciting, and it was certainly very productive from a physical appearance perspective, it might sound very appealing to do 30 grams of baking soda per day, to prevent muscle loss. But it takes its toll on the organs, and obviously on the blood work and the urinalysis. And, I would consider overall that experiment was not a success. So this was basically the worst creatinine and urinalysis results that I ever got. That was right before I did my 3-week or 2.5-week Superdrol protocol before I took my pictures. And of course, I'm not going to lie, after 2.5 weeks of Superdrol, my liver enzymes were pretty high. Again, we'll save that for a separate video when we analyze my worst liver enzyme results. Hope you find this helpful. Again, I do this experiment so you don't have to. It might sound appealing judging by the pictures, but again, the pictures don't always tell the full story. And I'm one of the few who is actually open enough to discuss that even though the pictures look good, the blood work, in this case, was not so good. Either way, take from this what you will. I hope it was informative, and thank you so much for watching. Vigorous crew, you guys know what to do. If you're looking for the most comprehensive guides to bodybuilding pharmacology, you can find the ebooks on my website, vigoroussteve.com/shop. If you're looking for personalized advice, you can find the rates to my services in the services section. Contact me if you're interested. Follow me on Instagram @VigorousSteve. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next video.